First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming to this webinar that the Safeguarding Adults Board is putting on, and I want to thank Rebecca for putting this on for the board regarding domestic abuse and safeguarding adults. This session is being recorded and will be put on our website along with the slides. We will disable the question section now because obviously, as Rebecca's noted, it's a webinar, so it's more of an information sharing. What we can do is, if there's time at the end, put on the chat and the discussion if we've got time. Otherwise, if you have any queries, you can email the board website. So I want to welcome Rebecca and we'll hand over to her now.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for inviting me today to do this webinar. So we are talking about domestic abuse and safeguarding adults today. We are, just to be clear, this isn't a replacement for training around domestic abuse, because what I can cover in an hour to try to reinforce the links between domestic abuse and adult safeguarding is not a replacement for proper domestic abuse training. So I will be touching briefly on the nature of domestic abuse, but ultimately there are directions about where to get proper training around domestic abuse. That's a picture of me. I'm a safeguarding advisor in adult social care, and I take a lead across the county for domestic abuse as well. A trigger warning. What I'm going to be talking about today is a difficult topic. We'll be talking about different types of abuse within domestic abuse. So just be mindful of that for yourselves. When we're talking about domestic abuse, we're not talking about them. We're not talking about other people who are going through this, the people that we work with. We are talking about ourselves as well, because the chances are that either yourself or somebody you know have been affected or are currently living with domestic abuse. And for that reason, and the slides will be shared on the board's website, for that reason, I've included information about places to get help. Particularly, we're lucky enough to have 4 outreach providers within Surrey, and these are the areas they cover with their details. So do reach out to them if you need any support. And as professionals, they are an excellent resource for giving us advice around cases. If somebody doesn't want to work with outreach, we also have the ability to effectively make ourselves the clients of outreach to get that advice when we're working with people who are experiencing domestic abuse. And on the Surrey Against Domestic Abuse website, that's where you'll be able to access training. There's a new training programme coming out in January, and that's where you'll be able to access that training. So our aims today, I've told you what our aims are not, and our aims are not to provide a full training in domestic abuse and its characteristics, because we just don't have the time today. But it's to give a greater understanding of how care and support needs can impact somebody's experience of domestic abuse, and to give some clear information about what we mean about the law in adult safeguarding, what we mean by care and support needs, and to know when to make a referral to adult social care. Last year, the Domestic Abuse Act came into law, and within that gave us a new definition, a clearer definition of what we mean by domestic abuse. And this is what it actually says in the law, but in layman's terms, it broadened the definition. So we're not talking about just intimate partner abuse, we're talking about behaviour within a family. So it talks about person A to person B, and it talks about lots of different relationships that could be. So it could be aunt, uncle, brother, sister, father, son, daughter. And it defines the abuse consists of any of the following. And historically, people thought about domestic abuse in terms of domestic violence, in terms of physical abuse, but the definition is much broader than that, to bring in elements such as economic abuse, controlling and coercive behaviour. Coercive and controlling behaviour is now a criminal offence, has been since 2015. And it recognises it as the most prominent behaviour that underpins the majority of domestic abuse cases. So the violence or the economic abuse or any other type of abuse is done within the context of coercion and control. And it's a pattern of behaviour which seeks to take away a person's sense of self, minimising their freedom of action and violating their human rights. It's a continuous course of conduct. It's something that seeks to oppress somebody's free will and reduce their space for action. So, for example, taking away somebody's access to money, taking away somebody's interaction with other people outside the home, other relatives, professionals, even taking away your ability to get out of the house, shoes, keys to the car, things like that. And some people who are living through that abuse may not be aware that it is abuse. So part of our role when we're working with people is to explain the types of behaviour that are abusive in the domestic abuse context, and try to give people the information to allow them to make choices. Some of you will be familiar with this. Lots of people that have done any work within the domestic abuse sector will have seen the Duluth Power and Control Wheel. This particular version is particularly looking at carers, the carer and cared for person relationship, talking about ways that the carer or the person perceived to be in that role of carer can use that power imbalance to perpetrate the abuse. So perhaps restricting their access to medical appointments, perhaps to care provision, to minimise their ability to be believed by suggesting that they are not to be believed, whether that be through a mental health condition, drug and alcohol use, dementia, something like that. And often care restraint. We talk about care restraint where somebody who is looking after somebody is struggling and finding it difficult. And we know that when carers are not supported properly, that can impact their ability to care for somebody. And unfortunately, often domestic abuse can be mistaken for care restraint. And we'll be talking about that a bit more later. But this is just an illustration of different ways that power and control can be used in a domestic abuse relationship. Throughout this webinar that I'm giving today, I was lucky enough to have a survivor with care and support needs who agreed to speak to me to give me some insight into her experience. And so we'll be hearing her voice as we go through today's webinar. And I think that's the most powerful way of us understanding the lived experience of somebody with care and support needs who's experiencing domestic abuse. And they said here, I didn't think of myself as being vulnerable or having needs. So that's a trigger for us as professionals to know that sometimes people won't think about themselves in that position. So with the Duluth Power and Control Wheel, I already touched briefly upon how a perpetrator will use somebody's care and support needs against them. Somebody's vulnerabilities or somebody's needs can be used as a tool for perpetration and increasing that oppression. Things like belittling somebody, saying nobody else would want you, or suggesting that person shouldn't be believed. She has mental health problems, don't listen to her. She doesn't know what she's talking about, or he doesn't know what he's talking about, he's got dementia. Restricting access to medication. We've got lots of health colleagues on the line. They'll be clear about how essential it is that somebody accesses their correct medication, whether that be for physical health or mental health. And restricting that or not giving it in the proper dosages can actually then have a cause and effect on somebody's care and support needs, which can then be also portrayed about somebody being unstable, etc. Not allowing support with washing and dressing, taking away continence products. Those that are experiencing incontinence issues, if they don't have access to continence problems, then that's potentially going to restrict their wish to go out in the community. Not taking to health appointments. And there's been quite a lot of work recently in the health sector for children and for adults to get a greater understanding of, rather than recording something as did not attend, but actually recording it as was not brought. So if somebody is unable independently to go to an appointment, whether that be a child or an adult with care and support needs, that being recorded as that they were not brought to the appointment rather than they didn't attend. Gaslighting, exacerbating mental health, making someone doubt their own perception of what's going on for them. Not allowing equipment in the house, adaptations that are needed in the house, such as, shower, level access showers, rails, stair lifts, anything like that. By not allowing that equipment in the house, that's further decreasing that person's ability to be independent in their own home. This is something that comes up a lot, of grooming of professionals. If we are looking at a situation where there is, and we know when we're looking at any situation, we should have an open mind. What is going on here? Could it be carer strain? Could it be domestic abuse? Often perpetrators will portray themselves in such a way to make us think that they are a very caring individual, that they're looking after their mother or their partner or their father. And in fact, there's an element of grooming professionals in the same way that behaviour is used to groom the person who is having domestic abuse perpetrated upon them. And a very powerful tool, especially for somebody with care and support needs, is you couldn't look after the children alone. You have to stay with me, because with your disabilities or with your mental health, there's no way that they're gonna, the they that is used to describe services, there is no way that they would let you look after the children alone with your conditions. And what our survivor tells us is that talking about how I can't care for myself is difficult and embarrassing. Sometimes for us professionals, we're so used to talking about things, about difficulty going to the toilet, difficulty washing and dressing, that sometimes we don't acknowledge just how difficult it is for somebody who, in their daily life, if they're experiencing domestic abuse, they're having control taken away from them on a daily basis. So to also admit that there are other elements of their day-to-day lives that they're struggling with and they are struggling to do themselves is a huge barrier to admitting that somebody is struggling. As I said, with the Domestic Abuse Act in 2021, it's enshrined the broadening of our definition of domestic abuse. So when we're talking about domestic abuse, we're not just talking about intimate partner relationships, we're talking about interfamilial abuse. And there was MOPAC, the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime, commissioned a review of the homicides across London in 2020, and that was completed by Sky. And what they found in this research was particularly in all but 2 cases, the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator was that of parent and child. 4 were mothers killed by sons, 2 were fathers killed by sons, and 1 father was killed by his daughter. The remaining 2 cases were siblings. What they found for those cases of interfamilial homicide was that the victims in that category had a higher than average age, majority being over 65. Nearly all the perpetrators in those cases had serious mental health problems, and in 1 case the perpetrator also had a learning disability. In 6 of the cases reviewed, there was a caring relationship between the victim and the perpetrator. And that's where our open-minded safeguarding work comes in, where we are trying to differentiate between a carer under strain and the presence of domestic abuse. The majority of cases, the behaviours that were being seen would meet the definition of domestic abuse, including destruction of property, emotional, physical abuse and financial abuse. However, rarely were they recognised by practitioners and specialist domestic abuse support, by practitioners that it was domestic abuse, and therefore specialist domestic abuse services were not involved. So it's part of what we want to do today is really getting us to broaden our thoughts around domestic abuse. that we're looking at interfamilial abuse as well, and that's where we need to get involved our specialist domestic abuse services. So thinking about that, thinking about what we're looking at care and support needs, people with some sort of disability or condition, how that fits in with safeguarding. And our care and support statutory guidance from the Care Act tells us that safeguarding means protecting an adult's right to live in safety, free from abuse and neglect. It's about people and organisations working together to prevent and stop both the risks and experience of abuse. And that's the guidance around Section 42 of the Care Act. For those that have had encounters with me before, they'll know that I spend quite a lot of my time walking around with my brownie guide salute to think about the three parts of Section 42 and whether they are met and whether we have in adult social care a duty to undertake an inquiry. The first of those is the need for care and support, and particularly important is whether or not the authority is meeting any of those needs. The next is experiencing or at risk of abuse or neglect. And it's very important to pay attention to the beginning of Section 42. We're talking about reasonable cause to suspect. So we're not talking about a definite knowledge that abuse or neglect is happening. We're talking about suspecting. So for domestic abuse, if there is reasonable cause to suspect that somebody is experiencing domestic abuse, then that would be triggering the middle part of Section 42. And then as a result of those needs is unable to protect himself or herself against the abuse or neglect or the risk of it. What the Care Act tells us is there has to be a causal link between the care and support needs and somebody's not being able to protect themselves. And being able to call for help is not the same as being unable to protect yourself. I use the analogy of drowning. Somebody who is drowning may be able to wave and tell others that they're drowning. However, that doesn't stop them from drowning if they are unable to swim. So just being able to say, hey, this is happening to me, does not mean that there is an ability to protect themselves. So if the adult social care Section 42 duty is triggered, the Care Act tells us that the local authority must make or cause to be made whatever inquiries are necessary to enable us to decide whether any action should be taken, if so, what and by whom. So there's action for adult social care, but action within the wider system of different organisations working with that person. Domestic violence has been cited as one of the categories of abuse in the Care Act. Obviously that could do with some updating to make it domestic abuse rather than violence, because as I mentioned at the beginning, we're very clear that violence is something that happens in the context of coercion and control and overall domestic abuse. But clearly in the Care Act, domestic abuse is defined as one of the categories of abuse. Our survivor told us that police and other agencies did not recognise them as being vulnerable. And it's understanding what we mean when we're talking about vulnerability. Thankfully, Sky has given us some guidance around what we mean when we're talking about an adult with care and support needs. So we may be talking about an older person with physical disabilities, learning disability or sensory impairment, mental health needs, including dementia or personality disorder, a long-term health condition, and someone who misuses substances or alcohol to the extent that it affects their ability to manage day-to-day living. So Surrey has used those definitions as a guidance for what we're talking about when we talk about someone with care and support needs. Just to caveat that a little bit, you can have an older person who doesn't have care and support needs. So that term older person can be misleading and all-encompassing, because as you know, you can have older people who don't have care and support needs. And the care and support statutory guidance also gives us a steer to think about what do you mean about care and support needs. It's a mixture of practical, financial, emotional help or support for people, adults who need extra help to manage their lives and be independent. And the eligibility criteria tells us that these are eligible needs are these. Now, for thinking about our safeguarding response, it's really important that we break the link between eligibility for a service and a care and support need that would trigger a Section 42 response. So in order to be eligible for a service from adult social care, this is what our eligibility regulation tells us, that an eligible care and support need is one that arises from or is related to a physical or mental impairment or illness. It results in the adult being unable to achieve two or more of the outcomes specified in the regulations, and we're going to look at those in a minute, which is likely to have a significant impact on their well-being. However, for the purpose of adult safeguarding, the board's policy and procedure lays out really clearly that actually items 2 and 3 are not relevant in determining whether our duty has arisen to undertake a Section 42 inquiry. So it's not about a significant impact, it's that there is an impact. And rather than it being 2 or more, it's whether it's just 1. So to be clear, there's nothing in the statutory guidance, but Surrey Adult Safeguarding Board, Surrey Safeguarding Adult Board even, have been clear that that is how we are defining care and support needs. And these are the outcomes that we work through. So those that work in adult social care will be very familiar with these when doing their Section 9 assessments for whether people are eligible for support. We've got things like managing and maintaining nutrition, maintaining personal hygiene, managing toilet needs, being appropriately clothed, making use of the home safely. And often as professionals, we're really good at zoning in on those first 5 or 6. Those are the ones that we may instantly come to mind. But thinking about developing and maintaining personal, family or other personal relationships, accessing and engaging in work, training or volunteering, making use of the community, accessing facilities in the community and carrying out caring responsibilities for a child. This is where we need to perhaps pay a bit more attention. So in order for our duty to be triggered under Section 42 as somebody being deemed as having care and support needs, they would need to have their care and support, their condition would have to have an impact on only one, and there is no threshold for it being a significant impact. So actually the bar for a safeguarding response is much, much lower than eligibility for services. Thinking about the last of the outcomes about looking after a child, what our survivor told us was that if they told people how much they struggled, she felt that they would say that they couldn't look after their child. And it's important to think about in the outcomes for somebody looking for a service from adult social care, that is one of the outcomes that adult social care should be looking at when providing services to support someone to be a parent. So that can also be a barrier to somebody really telling us that they have care and support needs. Also within the context of domestic abuse, they won't want to tell us that anyway because of the context of the abuse that they're experiencing, and in all likelihood having been told they would be unable to look after their child. So once we decide that duty has been triggered, these are the objectives that an adult social care inquiry has, the Section 42 inquiry, and it's central to that. It's important to note as well that in Section 42 of the Care Act, there is no mention of consent and there is no mention of capacity. The local authority's duty to undertake a Section 42 inquiry does not require the consent of the person. So regardless of whether the person has said that they want a Section 42 inquiry to progress or not, the local authority's duty has been triggered, and therefore that Section 42 should carry on anyway. When that feels slightly counterintuitive with our making safeguarding personal approach to the work that we're doing. However, once the jump has been gone over that our Section 42 duty is triggered, we're undertaking an inquiry, that's where we absolutely, the needs and wishes of the person are paramount to how that inquiry is conducted, and particularly with domestic abuse, where people are experts in their own risk, where people understand what will increase the risk for them. That's where we need to be listening to the survivor, listening to the person and their own experiences. Within the inquiry, we'd be looking to assess the needs of the person for protection, support and redress, and how that would be met. And that would be doing that as a group of organisations, but particularly for adult social care, that would be an assessment of need under Section 9 of the Care Act. Protect from the abuse and neglect in accordance with the wishes of the adult, make decisions as to what follow-up action should be taken, and enable the person to achieve resolution and recovery. There's lots of work about needs-led, strength-based work within the domestic abuse sector, and that really ties in with making safeguarding personal. That what's important to that person, what will reduce the risk for that person. And we'll go on to some case studies in a while where we really look at that, where we're not enforcing our own views about what should happen in a situation, that we're listening to the person and what's important to them. This is one of the most interesting sections of the Care Act. Lucky I can't see your faces to pull expressions that perhaps you might not think the same. But Section 11 of the Care Act gives people the right to refuse an assessment under Section 9, a normal assessment of needs. People have the right under Section 11 to refuse that assessment and to say, no, thank you, I don't want that. However, there are two instances when a local authority must carry out the assessment regardless. The first of which is where the person lacks mental capacity to refuse, and it would be in their best interest to do so. The second, which is more pertinent to what we're talking about today, is that the adult is experiencing or is at risk of abuse or neglect. So if you have somebody who you believe has care and support needs, and you also have reasonable cause to suspect that they are experiencing domestic abuse, Section 11(2)(b) removes that ability to refuse. There are many reasons, as I said, people being experts in their own risk. There are many reasons why that person may be saying to you, I don't want an assessment of my needs. And that is built in with the abuse that they're experiencing, the feel that they could be increasing the risk to themselves by having other organisations involved. And so with this, it would be gathering the information. What paragraph 6.2 of the Care and Support Statutory Guidance tells us is that where an adult who is or is at risk of abuse or neglect has capacity and is still refusing assessment, local authorities must undertake an assessment so far as possible and document this. And this is about working together with our police colleagues, with health, with our outreach colleagues. And should continue to keep in contact with the adult and carry out the assessment if the adult changes their mind and asks them to do so. So we've got two musts there from Section 42. If our three-part trigger to undertake our duty to undertake a Section 42 is triggered in adult social care, then we must undertake an inquiry, regardless of consent, regardless of capacity. And then Section 11(2)(b) also tells us that if there's reasonable cause to, if there's a belief that somebody is experiencing abuse and may have care and support needs, there's a duty to undertake that assessment as far as is practicably possible, gathering information from other sources. Our survivor told us that they want to be helped to advocate for themselves within a system that's often adversarial rather than supportive. And sometimes there can be lots of barriers to somebody receiving support, whether that be support with their daily needs, whether that be financial support, whether that be housing, other agencies. What survivors are telling us is they want to be helped through that process, and whether that be through outreach or adult social care or other professionals that advocating for someone. So as I just said, these are the two elements to adult social care's response. We've got the Section 42 response, and we've got the duty to assess under Section 9 with our section as said by Section 11(2)(b). What adult social care can do when we're looking at the assess and support and provide support within adult social care, there can be the assessment of somebody's needs as a carer, because the person who is the carer may have care and support needs in their own right as well. So we would look at Section 10 assessments for carers, providing care through agencies, personal assistance paid for by direct payments, which then can sometimes remove the perpetrator's ability to control that person's day-to-day life, because those things are being provided by somebody else. So as I used the examples at the beginning of ways that perpetrators can use somebody's needs to further isolate and degrade them, by putting in support for that person, their needs are met in another way that isn't dependent upon the perpetrator. Equipment, assisting with daily living, and day services. Sometimes day services can get that person out of the property for a certain period per day. Supported living, residential nursing care, or signposting to other services. This is something which really made me think when this person told me this, it really made me think about how we provide services, whether that be health, adult social care, other services. That person knows where the risk is, what the risk is like for them, and what will keep them safe. They are the experts in their own perpetrator, the person who has been perpetrating the abuse. And sometimes we, as services, can provide solutions that we think, right, so that person's got care and support needs. They need help washing and dressing in the morning. They need support with their medication. They need all of those things. And particularly for this person, it was post-separation. So that person had moved to a new place where they didn't want their ex-partner to know where they lived in order to keep themselves and their children safe. We had adult social care suggesting an agency where often people can be on rotas, lots of different care workers coming in. For that person, that was going to be increasing the risk that somehow that information would get back to the perpetrator as to where they were living. So actually what worked for that person was the provision of a personal assistant, to have one person or two people perhaps knowing where the property was. So what can seem to us like barriers to help that's offered, actually there can often be really thought out reasons why that doesn't work for that person, and we need to think about that. So giving some case examples, people that I've worked with, people that I've been given information about. This was a case where an occupational therapist had visited this woman. She had a diagnosis of MS and lived with her ex-partner. They jointly owned the property and neither wished to sell the house or move out. She was aware that she was not going to be able to get a mortgage due to her deteriorating condition. And it was really important to her that she lived in a property that she had worked for and that she had got a mortgage for, and really important to her to live there. Her ex-partner felt the same and didn't want to give up that property. At the time, he was providing care for her, meal preparation, administering medication. She disclosed to the OT that he had been not providing that support, leaving her in soiled clothes, withholding her medication and food, There were other things like using the thermostat remotely to turn down the temperature in the property, which would then exacerbate her pain and the restriction of her movement. He was controlling, had a terrible temper before she became unwell, but things had got worse since her diagnosis and the deterioration of her health. Making safeguarding personal. So once the decision was made that a Section 42 duty had been triggered, that was when making safeguarding personal came into the fore and her desired outcomes were explored. A needs-led approach was adopted. So what was most important to her was remaining in her home, but she wanted the abuse to stop. She wanted to be safer within that property. So a disabled facilities grant was secured, which adapted her kitchen to allow her to make her own meals. So the worktops were lowered and lots of other equipment was put in, which allowed her to have independence with her meal preparation. And a support plan was put in place that provided care for things like personal care, for continence care, for administering medication was put in place, which then removed his control over those elements. She was also obviously referred to Outreach, who supported her in safety planning and other elements like that. So she was less reliant upon him for those elements, which then increased her ability, her space for action, and his ability to use her care and support needs to further perpetrate abuse. And the situation had improved for her. And that's something that's quite difficult for us sometimes as professionals, where we see that there is somebody experiencing domestic abuse and our wishes, our natural professional vision is for that person to be separated and no longer living with that person anymore. But this is where we need to listen to the people that are experiencing this and what's most important to them and how we can make them safe and make them experts in their own lives and make our inquiries follow what is important to that person. Don't assume that I can't do anything. Don't take over everything. Find my strengths. People who are experiencing domestic abuse, whether that be in an interfamilial context or whether that be in intimate partner relationships, are having their strengths taken away, are having their independence taken away. And so for us as professionals, we need to do the opposite. We need to find what people's strengths are, what they can do for themselves, and support that, be advocates for them in finding a path away from abuse. Got another example where a woman in her 20s with both existing health needs and those further caused by the abuse from her husband fled with her child. She had contact with children's services, police, mental health services, domestic abuse outreach services and health services. And something we know for survivors, once a disclosure has been made, once somebody has noticed or believes that domestic abuse may be happening, then suddenly the wave of services that come into that person's life can be overwhelming. And so it's our responsibility as organisations to coordinate how we work with people so that they're not getting 17 phone calls a day, all asking them to do something, all asking them to fill in a form or make a call or all of those things. We need to have an awareness of just how overwhelming it can be for somebody who is already experiencing a level of abuse which has taken away their control and their ability to do things. So all of these people, all of these different agencies were involved, all of whom were aware that she was fleeing domestic abuse and were aware of the impact of her health needs on her daily life. However, no professionals recognised her as having care and support needs. So therefore, no referrals were made to adult social care and no safeguarding inquiry was undertaken. And for this example, we're talking about physical health needs, but we need to be really clear that we are also talking about mental health needs, and that recognition across the board for us as professionals of when somebody has care and support needs that come from a mental health condition as well as a physical condition. And so hopefully from today, you're going to be thinking about those different outcomes, those different areas of life that I highlighted earlier. And if their condition is having an impact on any one of those, then we are deeming that they have care and support needs, and need to be thinking about making a referral into adult social care, or if you are adult social care, that our Section 42 duty is triggered. So no safeguarding inquiry was undertaken. So there was a significant delay in that person receiving the support that she needed. In the end, she was supported with a personal assistant 28 hours a week who provides support with personal care, nutrition, cleaning and all activities of daily life, allowing her to parent her child. That again takes us back to where are my strengths? So this person may need support with personal care or nutrition. Her strength was her parenting, and by supporting her to do the things that she was struggling with, then enables her to do the things that she was doing well already, being a protective factor for her child. Sometimes our survivor told us that sometimes being eloquent is a barrier. Now, we know domestic abuse has no boundaries around education, class, wealth, race, gender, sexuality. Domestic abuse is perpetrated in all areas of society. From, if you haven't already seen it, there was an MP who made a really powerful speech in the House of Commons about her own experience of domestic abuse. So from those that are making the laws of the land, our elected representatives in Parliament, across the board, everybody is just as at risk of experiencing domestic abuse as the other person. So often we can get a picture in our head of what a domestic abuse survivor looks like. And when we're thinking about that, we're thinking that the stereotype is working age mum with kids, working age woman with kids. We're not thinking about someone with a learning disability. We're not thinking about an older person. We're not thinking about an older man. We're not thinking about a younger man. We're not thinking about someone from the LGBTQ community. And particularly our survivor told us that being eloquent, being able to express themselves, meant that it was a barrier, that somebody didn't see them as vulnerable, didn't acknowledge that they might have had care and support needs. They found it exhausting. People saying, "We'll ring you tomorrow and let us know how you're getting on." Us having an acknowledgement of professionals sometimes can work in their own troughs. They have their duties that they need to complete, whether that be housing, adult social care, health, police, whoever. We work in our own area, but what we sometimes fail to realise is that person will be getting phone calls from all of those different areas, and that can be incredibly overwhelming for a survivor who is trying to make changes, who is managing the risk to themselves, who is perhaps trying to leave that relationship. And as we know, that is the most risky time for a survivor when they are looking at separation. As I said, I would direct you all to seek further training in domestic abuse to get a real understanding of some of the things that I'm mentioning as we go along. Another example, we have two men, both had learning disabilities. They were married and they lived together in supported accommodation with 24-hour support. The mother of one of them had control of her son's finances. She was calling constantly, dictating to the support workers when and where her son and husband could go out. She didn't approve of their relationship and visited the home often to check if they had been sharing a bed. If she was challenged, she could become verbally abusive to staff, her son and his husband. And again, this reinforces that sometimes we're not talking about the intimate partner relationship, we're talking about another family member. And in this case, it took a while for us as services to recognise actually what we're seeing here is domestic abuse. If we go back to our definition from the Domestic Abuse Act, we've got somebody with a relationship, mother and son, and there is the perpetration of some of the types of abuse. So we've got controlling and coercive behaviour, we've got financial abuse. So Adult Social Care worked with police, outreach and support workers to support the couple to set clear boundaries with the mother and explain what was important to them, what they want to do, including in terms of their relationship. And it was important to the son. The son wanted to maintain a relationship with his mother. And sometimes this can be a challenge in interfamilial relationships when we're dealing with mother, son, father, daughter, whoever. There is often a wish to maintain that relationship, but to have it in a way that is abuse free. And that is where we need to listen to the people that we're working with. There was a piece of research done at Aberystwyth University. I had to practice saying that a while, bit of a tongue twister, around domestic abuse and dementia and the coexistence of them. What they found was that across the world, domestic abuse affects 1 in 3 women, and every 3 seconds someone develops dementia. Yet, despite the prevalence of both of these issues, if we thought about a Venn diagram, both of those issues, they're going to overlap, but there's little attention given to what happens when they're combined. So as a result, of older people living with dementia are often the forgotten survivors of domestic abuse. Dementia can result in a lack of inhibition. So whereas previously a victim survivor may have deliberately hidden their abuse from people, having developed dementia, they may talk more openly about their experiences, causing a perpetrator to be fearful of public exposure or prosecution, which again can raise the risk to that person. Whereas before they were doing their own risk assessments every day, every minute of their lives, and knowing that by not disclosing this abuse, they are keeping themselves safe because the perpetrator may escalate the abuse should they make a disclosure. With the advent of dementia, that is gone, and therefore they may be making disclosures to people, which may then increase the risk to themselves. There was a particular case that we were working with where a day centre for people with dementia reported that a woman's husband and carer appeared overbearing, would not let her out of his sight, declined any services, which meant them being separate. He spoke about her disrespectfully and at times had become aggressive with staff. She presented as having advanced dementia and limited speech. Her husband was very resistant and would not let workers speak to her alone. And again, this comes back to where something can be presented. The presenting narrative can be, I am a carer under strain. I'm the only person that can deal with this. I don't need any of your help. I'm just stressed out because I'm caring for this person. So when we are approaching our safeguarding work, we do so with an open mind where we are thinking, is this carer strain? Is this domestic abuse? And one of the ways we can look at that is by undertaking Section 10 assessments, carers assessments with a carer. Because if a carer is under strain and services are provided, that will reduce the strain. And the other hypothesis we're left with is that actually domestic abuse is here present. So this was a very tricky case to get to speak to this person alone. So Adult Social Care established a relationship with the husband as a carer, and established trust to the point that at times he then allowed the worker to take this person to the day service. Once that person got in the car with the social worker, their presentation completely changed. Where they had been almost non-verbal and portrayed an image of dementia that was so advanced that they were unable to speak, when they got in the car, independent from their husband, that veil was lifted and they were able to very clearly disclose high levels of coercion and control, high levels of violence from their husband. And her presentation was a way to keep herself safe, because if he thought that she was unable to communicate with anyone, then he would feel less threatened by her having any interaction. She'd been cut off from her children and from any other interaction with anybody, services, family, friends, everything. So plans were put in place for her to go to respite care, and then the plan with her was that then she would not return, and then look at seeking legal steps around property and things like that. And so adult social care had also supported her to make contact with her estranged sons. On the day that she was planning to leave to go to respite, the husband refused to let her go, and at that point there was some excellent joint work with the police, who visited with adult social care and supported her to be able to leave the property. But so it goes back to what I was saying around the presentation of dementia and the coexistence with domestic abuse, but in this particular case, it was being used as a shield, as a protective factor for that person to keep themselves safe. That same piece of research has also said that a survivor with dementia, perpetrators of domestic abuse, can deliberately act to cause confusion and disorientation. So if we're talking about gaslighting for somebody without dementia, imagine the impact for somebody who is in the early stages or the later stages of dementia, to be gaslit, to be told, no, you didn't leave your coat there. What are you talking about? Or you've left the door open, or you left the gas on. Making them doubt themselves, making them doubt their own deterioration. So it can often be used to undermine capacity and promote fears that the individual will not be believed if they disclose abuse. So presenting to professionals, this person is much more confused, much more cognitively impaired than is in fact the reality. It's also flips onto the other side, that sometimes a perpetrator with dementia can be seen as less of a risk. Well, he's got dementia now, but it may be that he'd been perpetrating, or she had been perpetrating, that abuse their whole marriage. And actually, just because they have increased frailty and dependency should not be viewed as posing less of a risk to the victim survivor. So we should be working with people with diagnoses of dementia, whether they be victim survivors or perpetrators, and assessing the risk individually. And our survivor again reinforced this message that people think that he is caring and attentive. They think he is under stress because of looking after me. So that's not confusing the two. Audits, we completed an audit of inquiries in adult social care a few years ago, where we looked at cases where the source of the risk had been highlighted as a family member or an intimate partner, and the boxes had been ticked for things like physical abuse, financial abuse, and we looked at those cases because they hadn't been named as domestic abuse, and we looked at those cases and found that often carer strain, domestic abuse was mistaken for carer strain, and there were elements of behaviour that were described as being the carer under strain. Things as dramatic as putting a towel over somebody's face and pouring water down it, which is simulated drowning, otherwise referred to as waterboarding, and those things were thought of as a carer being under strain, whereas actually it should have been recognised as a way to perpetrate fear in that person, and clearly an element of domestic abuse. We've then got a woman was being abused by her then partner. They both drank and took drugs. She was not an addict when she met him. He very much encouraged her intake. And this is something that we see a lot, that addiction and substances used in the act of perpetration, because that's another form of control. So to get somebody addicted, or to meet somebody who already has substance misuse issues and use that as a further way of control, restricting or giving the substances. So those, again, when we're looking back to our our outcomes, where we're thinking about things that make people eligible for their outcomes, that substance misuse, if it's impacting any of those, then we are looking at triggering our duty to do a Section 42 inquiry. So by the time she realised she was being abused, she was an addict. She has said numerous times that when she tried to disclose, she was seen as that problem woman. So people with chaotic lifestyles, transient lifestyles, difficult lifestyles can often be seen as problematic and not looking at the abuse that they are experiencing. It's worth noting as well that sometimes, often, substances such as alcohol and drugs can be used because of the abuse to try to numb the experience that people are having. So she disclosed to 16 GPs in a 13-month period. No one ever saw past her addiction. She was highly vulnerable and trying to get clean when she left. However, she was given accommodation in a mixed hostel and was sexually assaulted whilst there. She now lives clean, sober, and is an outreach worker. So thinking about the vulnerabilities when we're thinking about placing people that have experienced domestic abuse and their co-vulnerabilities through their care and support needs. Alcohol and drug addiction is a barrier to people seeing and acknowledging the coexistence of domestic abuse. In fact, if they're present, that almost tells us it's more likely that this is what's going on, that something has happened to that person is experiencing abuse, whether that be from a family member or from an intimate partner. So I've pulled us back to one of the previous slides, that an adult with care and support needs may be somebody who misuses substances or alcohol to the extent it affects their ability to manage day-to-day living. And that barrier is that threshold isn't around significant impact, it's around does it have an impact. Some of you may be familiar, we had a recent SSAB published in July 2021 for Mary. That's not her name, that's a pseudonym. What the Domestic Homicide Review found, what happened was that Mary died in 2017. An inquest into her death, the coroner found that she tied a ligature around her neck and died by hanging. She'd drunk considerable amounts of alcohol and taken cocaine. It's not possible to determine whether she intended to kill herself. In the months leading up to her death, she had contacted the police on 14 occasions in 2017, reporting that her relationship had become abusive and violent. In the period before she died, her oldest child went to live with his father and her two youngest children were taken into foster care. The learning for adult social care was the recognition that when these five of these occasions, events were reported to adult social care and they should have been recognised as an adult safeguarding concern that met the Section 42 duty. So for Mary, for the Safeguarding Adult Review, it was also a domestic homicide review. And we have quite a few of those in Surrey at the moment, where we're not looking at people that have been killed by their intimate partner or their family member. We're looking at where people have taken their own lives in the context of domestic abuse. And that is something we need to be, that needs to be at the forefront of our mind when we're thinking about our Section 42 duty and making referrals in to adult social care. We're looking at drug and alcohol and mental health issues would also trigger somebody having care and support needs. So the learning that came from the tragic case of Mary was that there were 5 occasions where they were reported and we should have recognised it as a concern and that there should have been an adult safeguarding inquiry, and 2 of the referrals explicitly mentioned coercion and control. So going back to our 3 parts, there was an existence of substance misuse and mental health. This person, there was specific mentions of coercion and control, so that's our abuse or neglect trigger met. And the causal link between care and support needs and somebody's ability to protect themselves with domestic abuse, somebody's care and support needs will always have a factor in the perpetration of abuse and the success of that perpetrator's ability to perpetrate abuse. So we need to think about that. The decisions that adult social care made with Mary, there was a confusion between the 3 different decisions. So For those that work in other organisations other than adult social care, the first two are relevant to decide whether to make a referral in, whether to raise a concern. Do you think that this person might have care and support needs? Do you think they might be experiencing abuse? If that's a yes, then there's a duty to refer in, to raise a concern. The next part is for adult social care, about whether the three parts have been met, and then the outcome at the end of the inquiry is determining whether abuse or neglect has occurred. So there are three different parts, there are three different decisions along the road within adult safeguarding. And actually what happened with Mary was that adult social care treated the referral of an adult safeguarding concern as a referral for assessment. So the person turned down the assessment when adult social care contacted them, and adult social care didn't carry out their assessment. Now, for all the people here today, I know that you're all screaming out saying, what about section 11.2b? What we are sharing now, what us as a group here now know, that actually, even though she turned down the assessment, because of the concern that she had care and support needs and was experiencing, or maybe experiencing, domestic abuse, that ability to refuse the assessment under section 11 was taken away by 11.2b. So adult social care should have carried out an assessment even though they didn't want one. Our survivor is saying, ask the questions. Often we get really used to asking questions that are relevant to our own paths. So adult social care, I've been in it for 22 years now. Very quickly you get used to asking somebody the most intimate questions about how they go to the toilet, how they wash themselves. It becomes bread and butter on a daily basis. What feels more uncomfortable is asking, are you experiencing domestic abuse? Have you ever experienced domestic abuse? Are you frightened of someone? Is there somebody? What's your day-to-day life looks like? Are there things that you are not able to do because somebody is stopping you? And the same for other partner agencies who may be less comfortable with asking about those things that adult social care get very used to. Asking those questions, do you have any health or mental health needs? Are there things that you struggle with? Because if they say that they are, and there are things that they struggle with, then that will tell you that I need to be thinking about a referral into MASH under safeguarding. So thinking about what I can do, what we can do. Get training in domestic abuse. I have done the lightest of touches here today in really getting to understand about what the perpetration of domestic abuse looks like for interfamilial and intimate partner relationships. There will be the domestic abuse, Surrey Against Domestic Abuse partnership will be reissuing the training from January. I would advise everybody to get booked on as soon as you can. The next 4 slides that will be shared on the board's website has got lots and lots of further reading, videos, links to websites that you can look at to get some further information as well. Notice the signs and be aware how to make a safe inquiry. Safe inquiry means ensuring the potential perpetrator is not and will not easily become aware of the concerns. So, for example, sending a letter to the property of the person where they live with their perpetrator, saying we understand that there's a concern about some level of abuse. We can't be sure that that letter won't be opened by the perpetrator. And we know that risk is increased when perpetrators are aware that their control is being threatened. And sometimes that can be by our intervention, by us becoming involved. That can be enough of a trigger for things to escalate. And ultimately, when we're talking about domestic abuse work, we're talking about homicide prevention. If we could relabel it, what we are trying to do in the work that we're doing, in all the examples that I've given today, we are trying to reduce the risk of the worst case scenario happening. So thinking about safe inquiries, making sure that you ask survivors about any health conditions or care and support needs. And if you think you may, not must, may have care and support needs and may be experiencing domestic abuse, make a referral to MASH. to the multi-agency safeguarding hub. Make sure referrals to adult social care describe the care and support needs clearly. To understand, to allow adult social care to see what you're saying. This person has care and support needs. Be prepared to challenge. I've given you the tools today. You're going to be skipping out of here knowing very clearly what section 11.2b is and what section 42 is and when adult social care's duty is met. Use that knowledge, use it to challenge adult social care. If you feel that a decision is not correct, respectfully challenge those that we work together. We're open to that. Recognising the different needs for people with care and support needs may have when giving advice services. So whether that's outreach, housing, health, that people may need more time, they may need different communication methods. Part of the research that Safe Lives have done around, which is one of the links that that's in the slides, talks about the length of time when you're working with a survivor, an older person, that the path of the work that professionals do with that person is often longer with older people, because it's about getting that recognition where they are on that cycle of change. And sometimes it may not be an understanding that they recognise that what they're experiencing is domestic abuse. Work with other organisations, seek advice from outreach services or adult social care or MASH. It's about joined up every single safeguarding adult review, every single domestic homicide review, every single serious case review for children would have a standing paragraph that says different agencies all held different information, but they hadn't shared that information. If they had, we would have had a wider picture of where the risk is. So don't keep that piece of the jigsaw to yourself. We need to work together as organisations to share the information to allow us to do proper risk assessments of the situation. So as I said, the slides have got, I've got links to lots of further resources. So you not only come to this, but you get homework. And that's the extra links that I will share with you. So that brings us, we've got about 15 minutes left, Sarah. So I'll hand back to you.
Thank you for that, Rebecca. Really valuable, and I think all the attendees will take something away, hopefully back into your own organisations. And as Rebecca has already highlighted, anyone who needs to seek support following this webinar, please do so.